humor at whose cost, right? I think what is the definition of humor is now going to decide whether that humor is allowed or not. And we've stopped laughing at our establishment. We've stopped laughing at the state. We've stopped laughing at those in power, for a while now.
Yeah, has closed the case. They have said that this was a simple case of suicide. You didn't have a single of these anchors who, for 5 months, 24/7, were bringing you night after night, one episode and the other on what has Rhea done. Is she doing Kala Jadoo? Did she feed drugs? None of these channels had the decency to put a breaking news sticker out, or at least, I mean, I'm being naive when I expect this out of them, because that was never the intention anyway, to talk about a tragic death in Bollywood.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Table Talk. I am Jyotsna. In the last few weeks, there's been a lot of churning of news. Some predictable, some people would rather not look at. For instance, the CBI closing the case on Rhea Chakraborty, saying that she was innocent, as many of us believed, in the suicide of Sushant Singh Rajput. Yet, she was vilified. She was called many names. Gold digger is amongst the more charitable names that she was called. Conspiracy theories were fanned by the media. Magar ab sannata hai. There has been no apology, and I would actually be surprised if there is one. So, almost 5 years later, Rhea and her family, her brother had also been sent to jail by a vicious media that had behaved like vultures. So, while there was COVID and we were all sitting quietly in our homes, this young woman was thrust out physically and emotionally. Magar, the media carries on, ringmasters in a circus till they find another victim. On the other hand, there is also the news of stand-up comedian Kunal Kamra. The venue where he was speaking has been completely destroyed, and people think it is absolutely normal to do so. Every week there is something that we want to speak about. Is it a distraction from the previous one? Or is it the way things have been normalized? That there is absolutely no conversation on jobs, on the fact that students are not getting placements in institutions like IIT, on corruption, on issues of governance. We are so enraged, हम इतने गुस्से में रहते हैं, that we seem to have lost all our humor. Yet the joke seems to be on us. Well, joining me on the show today, Manisha Pande from News Laundry and Kunal Purohit, who is an independent journalist and an author. Listening. Sometimes I feel that we are given no time to process information that comes out. अभी हम औरंगजेब की बात कर रहे थे, उसके बाद we moved on to Rhea Chakraborty. Before we could kind of work and go into the depth of that issue, we've come up with a new issue. But is that intentional? What really is going on with news, the perspective of media, with Manisha today, who's joining me from News Laundry, also joining me Kunal Purohit. He's also a writer, a journalist and an author. And I'm going to kick off this conversation very quickly without wasting any time, because we know what's been going on for the last few, well, I'd say about 10 days. But my question is to both of you, either of you can take this. Have we become a completely humorless country?
Well, actually, what followed after this whole week, after the controversy, was extremely funny. So I don't know if we're unintentionally funny or not, because, from the effigy burning to saying Kunal Kalra, hi, hi, to the phone call saying Tamil Nadu kaise aayega mein. It's been so ridiculous that I think maybe unintentionally, all the stand-up, I'll actually make that point that I think what followed after the outrage over Kunal Kamra's joke has probably been funnier than the stand-up itself. The totally ridiculous reactions, the furor over it, but in all of it, of course, I didn't know that, I wasn't very aware of the Bombay comedy scene, but every time an Instagram reel would go viral of some stand-up, you'd see that H, which is logo of Habitat. the venue that was completely trashed. And I learned this week that okay, this is the place for comedians in Bombay to go to, young, aspiring ones, established ones, to sort of have a safe space where they can test their jokes out and they can, you test their material out on a crowd. And that place was completely trashed, and it's very tragic to know from the owner who's given, spoken to various media houses, including us, saying that, give us some time, we'll have to shut shop for some time to figure out how we can come back and allow comedians to say what they want to, but also not have our walls redecorated by an angry mob every, second week.
Kunal, you're in Mumbai, so give us your perspective, and that same question applies to you as well.
I mean, I think essentially one part of it is of course, humor at whose cost, right? I think what is the definition of humor is now going to decide whether that humor is allowed or not. And we've stopped laughing at our establishment. We've stopped laughing at the state. We've stopped laughing at those in power, for a while now. I mean, one of the things that happened after, and Manisha was saying, that happened after the whole Kunal Kamra episode were videos that went viral from 15 years ago, 17 years ago. Clips from movers and shakers, clips from some other shows where people are dressed as Manmohan Singh and Sonia Gandhi, and making the kind of jokes where, I mean, I was for a minute, I'm like, oh God, how did we get that out? How is that allowed? And I think that's just, internally we've all started lowering our bar for what is allowed and what is not. And I think this episode was just a bit of a reminder of that, to be honest. And I mean, look, Manisha is absolutely right. The Habitat is an institution of sorts. I mean, I know so many young comics here in Mumbai who've been dying to just record a special there. So their debut video has to be on a Habitat stage, and that's the value that the Habitat has had. No other stage in the country has that value. So there's also currency in that, right? Just that logo that Manisha spoke about has great currency in that world, and that now there is a chance that that logo may never sort of come back. We hope it does, but the BMC's, and again, you're seeing that whole demolition bulldozer justice rolling out. So here, what we're seeing in the local news is the BMC is now, pinpointing every single small alteration and flaw that the building has, and essentially ensuring that they can't get back to business as it was before Monday. So we don't know if they're going to come back in the same form or not. And I think that the joke really is on us, right? The joke is really on us. It's not on people in power. It is on all of us who want to see people in power being mocked and being made fun of. And I think those avenues are now fast depleting.
It's important to understand that this happened in Mumbai, financial capital of India, entertainment hub of the country. We talk about ease of doing business, and here you had a business completely trashed. And
Absolutely.
forget ease of doing business, you don't even have institutional support. Like Kunal said, we saw the BMC come in with its own hammers, and there's a sort of an inquiry happening on the business itself. That was the victim in this case.
So, the other thing that's interesting is, I mean, I know a comic friend who is in the process of recording his own special, and he's again, very political. I don't want to take his name, very political, very sharp. When the Kunal Kamra episode happened, the venue that he was, he had already sort of started releasing tickets. The venue now started saying that, listen, we don't want our logo in the background. Whereas that used to be the big deal. The venue would want that because that's the only thing that they would sometimes get. So the venue saying, oh, we actually, we're still wondering if we should even host you. But if we do host you, we're sure that we don't want any identification markers. So I think there are so many cascading effects. I mean, I know comics
So
who are now
sad.
sort of rewriting jokes. Yeah, I mean, I think the impact that this is going to have on it's a bit like, the Hindi film industry and what we're going to talk about, which is what happens with Rhea, or what happens when Shah Rukh's son is targeted. I think when you look at the comedy scene in India, and when you look at some of the biggest names being hounded the way they are, you'll sort of start understanding the impact of it.
And yet, the reaction that we've seen from Kunal Kamra, and then there's been the reaction from Ranveer Alabadia. Drastically different, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think Kunal is a special specimen in that, if I may call him that. He, for Ranveer Alabadia, I mean, I think there's a huge difference between a content creator and a stand-up artist. And I think Kunal is essentially a stand-up artist. We may argue about what we think about his jokes, the quality of his show, blah, blah, blah. But he is a stand-up artist. And Ranveer Alabadia is essentially in the game of content, which is to put crowd pleasing stuff out there and get as many views and hits out of that as possible. So sometimes it can be about Vastu, it can be about aliens, it can be about why all men should store their semen or whatever. So all kinds of stuff. Whereas Kunal, I think with his comedy, is very aware of what he's doing. He is very aware of challenging people in power, and he takes that head on. That role that he's taken on for himself of challenging people in power. He's pretty, and it's not like he accidentally stumbles into controversies. He's very aware that he says this, it'll offend people, but so be it. I have to say it. So I think, and therefore you have very different kind of responses to once the controversy happens. Like Samay this week said that, I'm sorry, I'm going to learn from this and I'm not going to do this again. My mental health isn't, whatever. Yeah. Ranveer was very quick to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do this ever again. Kunal is like, okay, bring it on. Irrespective of what we think of, everyone has different choices when it comes to consuming the sort of content they want to on the internet. Both cases, they don't deserve to be questioned by the police, and they don't have to be answering about their craft and what they practice to a police officer.
Yeah, I mean, one of the cops, I think there's a statement on ANI where Mumbai police is saying that we're now going to look at all of the other jokes that he's been making, Kunal Kamra has been making about other politicians, and see whether they're offending. And I mean, is this really like a healthy functioning democracy where cops are going to go through your jokes in the past and then create offenses out of it? I mean, it is bizarre. So I think circling back to what you originally said, Joe. I think we're increasingly losing sight of what humor has to be, and especially what political satire has to be. I mean, some of the examples that you see abroad, they're so stinging. I remember I was in London just when the Queen passed away in 2022. And I found myself in a sort of in a stand-up comedy show, I think a day or two after. And I was horrified for the comic because he was cracking jokes about the Queen who had just passed away. And me from India, I said, how is he allowed to get away with this, right? But nobody cared. I mean, nobody sort of, because you know that there is a role that humor plays. And I think we're so far away from that place.
So this was also the week where the CBI announced that it has no evidence against Rhea Chakraborty. Not surprising to many of us. Kunal, you speak about lowering the bar. Can the bar be lowered any further when it comes to the media, Manisha?
After this controversy, you don't need any proof to establish the fact that we have a completely corrupt set of people in extremely powerful positions across newsrooms for television news. And I say this with a lot of responsibility because today, on Sunday, I think the news, it was a headline that CBI has closed the case. They have said that this was a simple case of suicide. You didn't have a single of these anchors who for 5 months, 24/7, were bringing you night after night, one episode and the other on what has Rhea done? Is she doing Kala Jadoo? Did she feed drugs? How is she spending her money? What sort of a woman is she? How was she with Sushant's mother? How was she with the sister? All sorts of stuff that we didn't want to know. We were being thrust for 5 months. None of these channels had the decency to put a breaking news sticker out, or at least debate it on their prime time that the case is shut and this was indeed a case of suicide. Then there was no murder, as a simple basic journalistic principle of following up on a story. But I mean, I'm being naive when I expect this out of them, because that was never the intention anyway, to talk about a tragic death in Bollywood, a very well loved actor. We're at the first cycle of the pandemic where we don't know what's really happening. We really are still figuring out how to grapple with COVID. And you have these anchors systematically take everyone's attention out of what we were dealing with in terms of a new virus. There was a migrant crisis unfolding around at that point. A lot of migrants were walking back home barefoot in some cases to their villages because there was no security for them in cities. And the government of the day was simply not telling us what their plan was. Unlike in many other countries where you had daily press conferences, briefings on how we're going to tackle this pandemic, there was completely one-way communication when it came to that in India. Instead of focusing on any of these issues, these anchors day in and day out hounded Rhea Chakraborty. That's one aspect of it, but completely distracted the country from what we should have been focusing on at that point. And it had real world consequences, unfortunately, for the people who were at the receiving end of this media circus. We had done a story in News Laundry on, we had a reporter just stationed outside Ria's house for about 2 days to just see the circus around it. It was ridiculous. Anchors hounding delivery boys who were coming there, anchors hounding her father, who's a very old gentleman, constantly kind of talking and screaming at the building. I don't even know what they were doing. But that was the kind of circus that we saw. You completely ruined someone's life. You ran a smear campaign.
So Mumbai police at the time later revealed that there were 80,000 fake social media accounts which were active to mislead the investigation. And of course, then we've seen how social media kind of enabled that whole narrative. But Kunal, it was also a society that just stood back, took out the popcorn and watched and believed.
It's possibly the only time when we were all in a state of collective hypnosis, right? A state of mass hypnosis, very, very carefully orchestrated by the media, aided by social media, political parties and political leaders wanting to make the most of it. And I think we've never seen anything like that before, right? Where essentially we created fact out of fiction. I mean, our news anchors every single day, our politicians every single day were throwing imaginary, bits at you. And we were all sort of lapping it up and consuming it and dissecting it and then making our own theories up, and then throwing it back, right? So there was this sort of two-way circulation, where constantly both players were in touch with each other and constantly sort of churning out rubbish, essentially. And I don't think we've ever sort of seen anything like that happen. And in the US, there's the Pizzagate, which was essentially something very similar, where again, out of fiction comes a fact, and then that fact is weaponized on the ground. And I think what we saw happening with not just Rhea, but with her family, with so many other people involved, I mean, people like the managers of celebrities and so on and so forth. I mean, so many people got crushed under this wheel, where essentially a political party wanted to benefit from the moment. Media houses were way too happy to sort of lap it up. And one of the things that I discovered while I was researching this whole bit a few months ago is to see that Republic, for instance, is topping the TRP charts, as Manisha would know. And for the first few weeks they sort of get that prime position, and then midway through the story they hike up their ad rates by 50%, right? Through the pandemic, midway through a story like this. And I think that just tells you of the vulture-like nature of Indian media, especially of channels like Republic and Times Now, which, as Manisha said, have not just not apologized. I think that's too far a thing to expect. But Republic is now back on the horse, and it's now flogging the same horse again. And essentially, it's been running this thing about how Disha Salyan was killed, and it's interviewing the father. Obviously discrediting anything else that the CBI would have said. And so we're seeing that they're now trying to take us back into that same place. And unfortunately, I think we as viewers of the news are just not wanting to object to it and saying, fuck all of this. Where are things that matter to my life? Where are things that matter to my child's education, to my healthcare? Why is that not news? We're just happy to willingly play on and watch all of this rubbish that's thrown at us all the time.
Manisha, I want you to just go back a little bit into that time, because you guys were covering it, minutely, the kind of reaction, but also looking into the future, because when media becomes the ringmaster of a circus, the next Rhea is actually just a primetime debate away.
We've always had propaganda and news, and that's not something new. This has always been a feature in a democracy, politicians wanting to use the media and the media getting used. But something fundamentally changes after 2016, in my view, after the JNU episode, where the media, along with being a government propaganda tool, turns against the very people that it's supposed to be working for. So whether it's students in JNU, or it's Sudha Bhardwaj, or it's activists in Maharashtra, or it's women in Shaheen Bagh, farmers sitting on protest, in each of these incidents, the media and television media has led the call to, put them behind bars or call them anti-nationals or call them Khalistanis or ISI funded or urban Naxals or whatever. So this feature of the media to go against people, to actively hound anyone that seems to be against the government is, I think, now very well established. So in that sense, you're very right that Rhea is just one of the many people that television news has victimized over the past 10 years. In Rhea's case, why it was very shocking for me to see it unfold, because here's a seemingly politically neutral person. Like there was no politics to this. So, you know, typically we had seen this with activists or with students who were protesting, or, like I said, Shaheen Bagh protests or opposition leaders also. But here's this case of this girl who comes from nowhere and then becomes this target and is actively hounded. Of course, there were the Bihar elections at that point, and this story was also used to whip up sentiments there. And so she becomes a casualty, just in this game. Television news today thrives on one villain or the other. Every night you require a villain who you can hound, or who you can call, you can say that let's imprison them. With Kunal Kamra also we've seen that. With Samir Raina also we've seen that. With Aurangzeb, long dead, but he's brought out every night to kind of say, so that's there. But a couple of things that, what does it say about us as society? I feel like even today, if you go out on the streets and you do just a vox pop and ask people what they think about the case, they will say that, something was wrong with that case. I think she was responsible for something. So it's really sad, but people still pretty much believe some aspects of the conspiracy. They may not agree that there was murder, but they will still blame her for something or the other. And that's where television news plays on our biases inherently. That it must be the woman. Here there's that Bengali woman also, right? That she's fast. And in fact, when you saw television news back then, when we were seeing, how the case was being shown, so it was the anchor saying that she's this or that, or she uses money, or she operated his bank account, and you'd see, the other half of the screen with her bikini shoots or wearing like skimpy dresses or whatever modeling shoots that she'd done. It was just playing that to drive home that point that here's this fast person. She wanted to make it big at the cost of Sushant, and she probably used him and his clout and his money because she can't have, any other role in life. So there is that inherent bias in all of us where we want to blame the woman for when things go wrong with a man. And television news very actively played on that. But we also need to think of why we fall for that all the time. And why do we easily believe that it must be the woman? And that's something that I think this episode completely exposed. But one point I want to make, what really got my goat back then was to see women anchors lead this sort of narrative. Primetime anchors, women especially, were driving this point and were peddling this propaganda of either Kala Jadoo or, uske dimag ko vash mein kar liya. I don't know what that means. That, somehow Sushant is supposed to be brilliant also, but he's also supposed to be very nice, that uska dimag easily vash mein Rhea can do. And, all sorts of misogynist sort of things. It was really sad to see women leading it. And then you wonder about, we've always called for representation of women in the newsroom. But if that's what women are going to do in the newsroom with their leadership positions, it's really depressing.
Patriarchal bargain. That's what it's called, isn't it?
Kunal? Women walk into the studio with a bag full of evidence and so on. So we've really seen the worst of it. But I just want to quickly also just look at this moment and let's pause a bit and see that if the media could actually orchestrate this whole thing from start to finish, right? And it could escape without any sort of punishment to it, without anything that's ever coming back to haunt them. It essentially sets a template for when they want to do this all over again, right? And as I said, Manisha listed out all of those examples of how they've been doing this. But I'm saying here in Rhea's case, they've literally invented most things, right? It's not even as if there was an event which certified some of what they were trying to say. There's a person who takes his own life, and then from there on you invent every single thing and then just let it spiral out of control. So my worry is that essentially, I think the bar for the television news in India has been lowered permanently. And I say this also as a journalist who's been on the ground, where the journalists that I speak to, my friends on the field, television reporters, tell me how they got away with absolute rubbish, with essentially making up stuff, with making up facts. And that was in conjunction with management in the television studios, because essentially they all just wanted to ensure that the story was running. Now, once you know that that is allowed, and that is okay, and that is also rewarded, because so many reporters got rewarded for doing that. I think that permanently changes, what you're trying to do in journalism. And so I think in some ways there's no coming back from it, unless there is something very drastic that forces you to.
And it feeds into the whole imagined grievances that we have as a country, doesn't it?
I just want to add that one reporter on Republic, who was supposed to be a reporter editor, Pradeep Bhandari, who was dancing, jumping around Ria's house, is now a BJP spokesperson.
So also, Kunal, you've written a book that kind of looked at how soft power was being weaponized, and to inflame communal biases. And now we've seen this whole Aurangzeb controversy as well with the movie Chhawa. Is it just the beginning of this change that we're going to see, that where everything is incorporated, everything, there is no part of society that has been left out to push a narrative?
Gulwalkar had said this very interesting thing, and I keep sort of wanting to tell people about this. And he said, don't bother about political parties, don't bother about political leaders. That's not what the Sangh is supposed to focus on, right? What the Sangh needs to do is build culture. Because culture will survive. Culture will outlast politicians, it will outlast political parties and leaders and so on. And I think what we're now essentially seeing is building of that culture, where that then becomes the most dominant form of it. Where a Santosh, for instance, and I've seen Santosh, the film gets banned because it's looking critically at how our establishment and how our institutions are Islamophobic, and against Dalits and so on. So that film will not be seen. What will be seen is a Chhawa, and what will be promoted in schools, what will be seen in Parliament. I don't know if there's a screening already or if there's one scheduled,
There is
but
one scheduled.
yeah, but so that's the sanctioned pop culture there. So essentially, that is the part of the project, where every sphere of not just your political life, because that is too mainstream, but every sphere of human life should have a reminder of sort of the more foundational values that the Hindu right wing wants to impose. And I think this is just a part of that attempt, as I said, building culture that then seeps into everyday aspects of your life, be it music, be it the news you read, be it sort of people around you, going to a park and seeing a Sangh Shaka. All that is also an essential part, and that is now happening so much more in urban areas like Mumbai, Pune, and so on. So it's the normalization of those values that is essentially at stake here, and that is what is the attempt.
And Manisha, 300 years, we can regress 300 years without batting an eyelid.
If you look at the channels, at least that's what the present is. But I am slightly optimistic about people in the country in general, and I don't think we should conflate a party winning with the entire mood of the country. I do think a lot of people are tired of endless debates on Aurangzeb or Shah Jahan or Akbar or comedy, who's offended, who's not, when there are real pressing issues in front of them. Unemployment being one. Just today you had a headline that there's been a remarkable drop in placements on IITs.
Yeah.
So I think when people are faced with real challenges and real problems, they do expect, irrespective of their party line, irrespective of who they want to vote for, they do expect their concerns to be reflected in the media. I think we still have that sense of traditional expectation from journalism and the media. And because we're not getting it from the mainstream media, you see a lot of people turn to YouTubers. Some of the people on YouTube who are actually talking about issues get crazy views, which means that there is a desire out there. There is a hunger out there for people, to want to see their issues reflected and being talked about. So I am hoping that a lot of these people who over the last 10 years have taken this easy route where you don't need any research, you don't need to brief yourself up with anything in the current affairs, you don't need to talk to experts, you can be the laziest journalist in the world, but you can still earn your money through your primetime debate on Aurangzeb. I hope that increasingly these people will not matter. And it's like with television entertainment, how it became so irrelevant because it became so bad after a point, and then you had OTTs kind of taking on that challenge of storytelling. I hope that's what happens with television news, that a lot of people just turn it off and figure that if you want to get something real, then go to the newspapers or go to that YouTube channel that's talking about what's happening. Only, to my mind, the only use of many of these television news anchors today is that if you watch their show, you can get the government line. So since you have no access to the current government, hardly meets you, there are no press conferences. If you want to know what they're thinking, you can just watch their favorite chamcha on prime time. So you get a sense of what they're thinking.
How do you wade through the noise? That's the challenge, isn't it, Kunal?
I mean, yeah, I think what we were both discussing, right? Just essentially focus on the issues that matter to you, right? I mean, keep. I mean, as citizens, I think we need to keep remembering that we need accountability from our leaders. We don't want them to be, sort of getting away with distracting us with issues that don't matter to my present, that don't matter to my future. And I think somewhere, I hope that we go back to it. I think the Lok Sabha elections showed us. I mean, when I was on the ground, I could see that BJP voters were pissed off because the party wasn't talking of the issues that mattered to them. But I hope that we're able to sort of hold that streak of accountability up for much longer than just an election, because what happens between elections is so much more important also sometimes. So I just hope that remains.
Yeah, and hopefully it's eternal, and hopefully the Indian Janta is going to realize कि jobs nahi hai, placements nahi hai, and there are bigger issues to speak about than the fact that a movie is right or a movie is wrong. But for now, Manisha and Kunal, lovely speaking to the two of you, and hope to get you guys back again someday.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.